this video. And there's this interesting through line with the original Ron Paul campaigns and how it was really the first time we saw this grassroots movement take advantage of decentralized media and the internet, to where, you know, you would have Ron Paul go up on stage in the debates and he would make a great point, but the corporate press would ignore him or criticize him. But then you would have like this delayed reaction where you'd have to wait a while to see just the grassroots support, or you'd have to see, you know, like grassroots events that are being organized around his campaign. But there's this through line where now we have decentralized media to where Dave Smith is able to go on Joe Rogan's platform and it's resonating instantly with millions of people. Dave Smith just recently did this debate with Douglas Murray that you alluded to. And immediately after, we're getting feedback that is extremely positive, where in the comments, hundreds of these comments are lambasting Douglas Murray. And you would think that debate after debate after debate, eventually we would get someone who was sophisticated enough to counter our ideas. And debate after debate, it seems like they fall flat and they just resort to ad hominems and straw men. So I wonder what you make of this through line, and just the moment we're in and how it relates back to the Ron Paul revolution.
Well, I think where people come down on this Douglas Murray, Dave Smith thing, that is the real defining question, because it says everything I need to know about that person. You know, for example, Dave Rubin just posted a thing about this, and you can already predict what Dave Rubin will say. And it seems like all these people who are part of this whole movement whereby the left left me, it became so extreme, I turned to the right. You know, that's great. And I'm glad we have people who are pointing out how crazy the left is. But when you migrate over into somebody else's political movement, maybe just as a matter of simple manners, you shut the blankety blank up for 5 years and learn things instead of telling them how they should run their movement or what their movement should be about. I mean, it's exactly like an immigrant comes to the U.S. and is going to lecture us on how we ought to organize our society. You know, I'm not that way. I consider that rude. When I visit a foreign country, I feel so. I try my best to speak the language, because I feel like I'm a guest, and it's the least I can do to show that I'm doing my best to be a good guest. You know, like I think a lot of people probably be annoyed if I'm walking down the street and some tongue they don't understand. So I do my best to be a team player with it. It would not occur to me to go there and say, I don't like this law or that law or that law, or you should bring more people in who look like me, or that just seems rude. Well, likewise for people coming over to the right, for them to show up and say, I'm going to tell you who's really on the right. And these other people, I'm going to invent this completely inane, pointless term, woke right, and call them that. No, you know what? You shut up, because you don't know anything. You have no knowledge. You have no standing to tell us how we ought to run things. But Dave Rubin is darn sure that you better listen to Douglas Murray rather than Dave Smith. I mean, what? So why? Well, so and a lot of these people, not all, but a lot of these people are not that impressive. These I left the left and came over to the right. I mean, I gladly receive them because I like to see people who change their minds. But if they were that smart, they wouldn't have been snookered by the left in the first place. I mean, imagine where your brain would have to be if you said to yourself, the left is where I should be. There's something screwy. Now, every now and then we get a genuine genius who just was screwy and changed his mind, and fine. But what's been happening is these folks, or this intellectual dark web, who are basically, some of them are okay, I guess, but that whole term, I think, reflects that the left wants to deal with, they want to deal with the spectrum only to about here. So as far as they know, the most right-wing people in the world are Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson. They can't even conceive of anybody over here. That's how they want it. But I don't care how they want it. So, so yeah, my view is that this idea that we need to police or we need to give condescending lectures to a Joe Rogan because he's not having enough people on who are going to repeat to you the exact narrative you've been getting every day of your life since you entered the fourth grade. But you know what? The whole podcasting world is filled with billions of hours of that kind of drivel. If you want it, it's all out there. It's everywhere. The underdog is the alternative view. And if it's wrong, then you get your own podcast and you go out there and you refute it. But you don't show up on Joe Rogan and insult him and most of his listeners with this, well, you can't have a dissident view on World War II because we all know it's this comic book and that's it. I mean, come on. Right? I mean, that might have worked in the 1980s because no one had any dissident thoughts in the 1980s. It doesn't work anymore because a lot of people are saying, well, I've now lived through nonstop lies from every official outlet for the past 10 years, 15, I don't know how long it goes. Nonstop lies. So now the natural consequence of that is I'm going to think, what else have I been lied to about? If I've been lied to for about everything in the world over the past 20 years, maybe I was lied to 30 years ago, but I just wasn't paying attention. Or 40 years ago, and I just wasn't paying attention. Or maybe just the interpretation of certain events is off. I'm going to go take a look. There's nothing wrong with that. That is perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with that.
There have been sort of a series of events over the last couple of years that have really pointed out this fissure that is occurring on the right. And the first one I think of is when Dave Smith actually had Tucker Carlson on his podcast, which was a huge surprise to me at the time. And I clipped this 10-second video where Dave says that Bill Buckley was the villain of the 20th century. And I threw this out there on social media thinking that this would get maybe a couple hundred likes and that it would just be something that my in-group found entertaining, that people who had read, Betrayal of the American Right by Murray Rothbard would like and would comment under. But I woke up the next morning and Meghan McCain had quote tweeted it. Ben Shapiro had covered it on his show. And it was just surprising to see that this was a third rail on the right. And in hindsight, I shouldn't have been so surprised. But since then, there have been multiple events like this in this alternative media we're seeing, or I guess it is the mainstream media now. And, Tucker Carlson went on Rogan's podcast, and he said that he thought the dropping of the atomic bomb was evil. And it got the same response from these same people, the Dave Rubins, the Ben Shapiros, the same people. And then I think it peaked with Daryl Cooper going on Rogan's show. And these people have not been able to recover. And Douglas Murray's debate with Dave Smith was really, I thought, their opportunity to counter it. My perception of Douglas Murray beforehand was that he was a very sophisticated person that some people on the right respect, including myself. I thought that his writings on the immigration problem in Europe was very important, and I listened to his commentary. And yet I was so surprised 30 minutes in with how little he wanted to argue on the actual merits of Dave Smith's points. And it just seems like with every debate that we libertarians have, that Dave Smith goes on these platforms, you would think that eventually someone would be able to counter them. And it's just time after time, it's almost like a Thucydides problem that we're observing on the right, where there's a waxing and waning of power. And they're observing that this new right, that this almost libertarian or populist right is rising. So they're resorting to this self-defeating strategy of lobbying, fallacies at the other side, but it's destroying their own side. And it's really fascinating to see.
And in a way, it's like they're all revealing themselves all at once, and I suppose there may be a place in society for people who are, willing to go so far, but not this far. I mean, maybe they play some role. Maybe maybe they're safer to listen to for people on the left and those people. I don't know, but I just have gotten to the point where I feel like the whole history of the 20th century has got to be revisited, because the world doesn't make sense right now if that story was true. So it really is true. I think what Tucker Carlson says, it really is true. We don't look like the side that won these wars. we look like a defeated people in a lot of ways. Something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. So, and now if you ask about this and you say, there are some profound problems with our society that don't seem to go back just to, Bill Clinton, or Lyndon Johnson or something, but maybe there are more fundamental questions we need to talk about. You get criticized by these people. Oh, look, they're, quote, just asking questions, but we know what that means. The questions are all sinister. Like, shut up. If you're not asking questions, what is wrong with you? I mean, I feel like what they want to stick to is a boomer worldview where, we bow down before statues of Churchill and Reagan, and that's the cool, quote unquote, right wing position. I think the world would look different if these men were what we were told they were. But I forswear to discuss this because I want to stick more to your topic, but I'll just say there's nothing wrong with saying there is a lot of good and valuable history of World War II, like A.J.P. Taylor, who by historians who are respected by everybody until one day everybody told us we weren't allowed to read them anymore. Like this is just dumb. This is dumb. Let people read and talk and take the positions they want to take, and you go ahead and spend your time refuting them if you want to. But standing there wagging your finger at them and hectoring them is a really ineffective strategy.
Yeah, I do want to stay on this topic just for a second, because you had, after this debate, Donald Trump took to social media and promoted Douglas Murray's book.
Yeah.
And you said that actually Donald Trump should be promoting Pat Buchanan's book. And I am currently reading Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. And thankfully, I think that the response to these debates, they have yet to learn the lesson of blowback. And, the response to the debates is that more people are going to search this stuff out, that Daryl Cooper's podcast is going to be extremely popular. People like myself are going to read Pat Buchanan for the first time. But what I found during this debate with Dave and Douglas Murray is that, and in interviews that Douglas Murray has done since, is Doug keeps throwing out the term revisionism as if it's just a given that we're supposed to hate revisionism. He's like, oh, these people just keep doing revisionist history. And I'm wondering if you can just make a case for revisionism from a libertarian perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, although, all of Pat's books are worth reading, the one I had in mind is the much easier to read book, A Republic, Not an Empire, and say, and have Trump say to the public, look, this is how our foreign policy is going to be transitioning now from an empire back to a republic. We're going to see if that can be done, because the empire thing hasn't gotten us anywhere except profoundly in debt and hated all over the world. So we're going to try something different. We're actually going to try something different. He could say that. That would really be nice. Hasn't happened, but it would be nice if he would say that. But in terms of revisionism, I remember growing up and being told that revisionists were stupid left-wing idiots who hate America. Now, there are revisionists who spend their time arguing that the American government has actually done a lot of terrible things. I have no problem with that, because I am not the American government. I mean, there are so many people who get offended when historians criticize the U.S. government. Look, you and the U.S. government are two different things. This has nothing to do with you personally. Stop taking it personally. All right. I promise you the U.S. government does not think you and it are the same thing. So don't be so unhappy about this. A revisionist is simply saying that maybe we didn't get it right the first time through. What are the chances we got everything right the first time through? Not 100%. Not to mention, a lot of times the stories of involving wars are told by the victors immediately after the cessation of hostilities. and the prejudices and the anger are all still riding really high. And is it likely that under those conditions we're going to get the real story of what happened? I doubt it. So we need to, in other words, now that the dust has settled, now that passions have cooled, let's go back and look again. Not to mention, half the time, we now have access to documentary materials that were not available to the historians immediately afterward. We now have the papers of such and such Secretary of State, which are available at the Library of Congress, or we have the diaries of this person, or we have volumes and volumes of records of one department after another in some other country that we can now look at and see if it tells the same story or not, or maybe it tells a different story. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if this were anything other than re-examining wars, re-examining things that governments love to glorify, everyone would think it was just common sense. Of course, you have to be a revisionist. And it could be that you look at it and you say, well, we have more evidence now, but the additional evidence we have simply bolsters our original instincts. Well, that's fine. At least you looked. And now you understand it even more thoroughly than you did before. So there's no harm in it. But yeah, I mean, anybody who genuinely wants the truth has to support revisionism. And after World War I, when the revisionists look back on that, because remember, the official version of the story was Germany was alone responsible for the outbreak of World War I. I mean, get out of here. Are you kidding me? So the historians went back and looked at that. And these were like Sidney Fay and Harry Elmer Barnes and others. And they argued differently, but they viewed revisionism as an instrument of peacemaking because they believed that revisionism could help overturn misunderstandings between countries and could overturn prejudices that people have. Once we get the truth out there, we understand each other better. It's more likely that we'll be able to treat each other justly in the future. That was how they looked at it. And that's, to me, honorable.
Yeah, I think so too. And specifically with World War I mean, my favorite part of the Douglas Murray and Dave Smith debate was when Dave said, without the Treaty of Versailles, we wouldn't have had Hitler. And Douglas Murray says, oh yeah, but then the Germans would have had to win. And Dave responds and says, but they weren't the Nazis. And then Doug goes, no, let me get to my main point. And it was just that small point where Dave acknowledges that the Germans in World War I were not the Nazis. That was so profound to me because Doug doesn't want to contend with that. Doug doesn't want to contend with World War I revisionism that says that maybe Europe would have been intact had the Germans not been defeated and had the monarchy not been absolutely destroyed. And I think the funny part about this is that even Churchill himself was engaging in revisionism after World War I when he blamed the Treaty of Versailles and Woodrow Wilson's entrance into World War I for the defeat of the Germans and for the fact that Britain lost most of its naval power after World War I as well.
I was hoping I could find it, but I'd have to dig around for it a little bit more. Ralph Raico has some great material on this. He was a great historian of Germany.
Rethinking Churchill is his essay that I've read on it.
Right, but he's also got some stuff about World War I, the Germany of World War I, and Germany wouldn't have had to win an overwhelmingly decisive victory. Even if they had just had a modest victory, the result would have been, there would have been some modest adjustments and Europe would have gone on. The regime in Germany was not totalitarian by any possible measure. So in other words, what Dave is saying is a completely legitimate line of argument that has been made by many people, like George Kennan. George Kennan says if we could have gone back to Europe pre-World War I with all those regimes in place, it probably would have been better than the result we had after 2 world wars. That's George Kennan. That's not crazy Dave Smith, whom you're not allowed to listen to. That's the architect of the containment policy who is held in high regard by basically everyone. So you see, so now you can't even have George Kennan's opinion. This is supposed to be the right wing. You can't even have George Kennan's opinion on international affairs. I mean, who are these creeps? Trying to narrow allowable discussion to that extent.
Yeah, and even Buchanan, he cites Niall Ferguson